The history of covert resistance within the extermination camps, including the events in Auschwitz, developed against the backdrop of rapidly changing conditions during the Second World War. By early 1943, the German leadership was facing growing difficulties on the Eastern Front, where the battles had become prolonged, exhausting available resources and increasing the demand for labor. This situation led to intensified use of prisoners in industrial production and resulted in strict control over everyone involved in the camp system. During this period, the conditions that made hidden forms of opposition possible began to take shape. Auschwitz had already developed a complex structure of subcamps, labor zones, and industrial sites tightly linked to the economic needs of Germany. Prisoners of different nationalities were assigned to work units depending on physical endurance, professional skills, and the degree of political unreliability as defined by the camp authorities. Among these groups were many women, including Jewish women, who were assigned to workplaces connected with the processing of explosive materials. These assignments provided a rare and extremely risky opportunity for them to come into contact with substances that could one day become part of covert resistance activities. The women who worked in these units faced exhaustion, illness, and continuous supervision. Yet they occupied a unique position that allowed them to move microscopic amounts of material unnoticed. The production structure itself, built on routine and repetitive tasks, created moments when the guards' attention shifted or became less focused. These brief moments allowed women to transfer tiny portions of powder that could later be combined into a usable quantity. By mid-1943, these individual acts began to take on a more organized form. Resistance inside the camp developed around small groups of people with coordination, experience, or contact with prisoners in other work areas. Since communication between units was strictly forbidden, the exchange of information relied on slow, cautious methods. Every movement and every object carried meaning. Any deviation from expected behavior could raise suspicion and lead to severe consequences. At the same time, the broader wartime context influenced prisoners' growing determination. News of the war filtered into the camp through brief overheard remarks or through newly arrived prisoners. They understood that conditions on the front were changing, and even the smallest indication of a shift created hope and encouraged more daring actions. In such an environment, even minimal signs of change became powerful motivators, strengthening the will to resist despite the risks. Women played a particularly significant role in this developing movement. Work with powder used in ammunition production appeared to be under the strictest control, yet the sheer volume of daily operations created a paradox. Tiny fragments of material, unnoticeable amid the mass of production, could eventually become the foundation for future plans. The women learned accuracy, caution, and consistency, enabling them to function within a narrow, strictly supervised workspace without attracting attention. As 1943 progressed, the understanding that resistance could take physical form grew stronger. Prisoners observed shifts in guard routines, changes in work schedules, and moments when administrative actions seemed rushed or disorganized due to external wartime pressures. Each change became a reference point for planning. Women contributed by maintaining reliability and discretion in their daily tasks, building trust and demonstrating capacity for coordinated action. Although no concrete plan yet existed, the groundwork was being laid. Resources were accumulating, trust was forming, and the belief that organized action was possible, even under extreme conditions, began to solidify. These gradual developments created the early structure of what would eventually become one of the most significant acts of resistance in camp history. At the center of this emerging story were the women who quietly created the essential element for the future uprising without any possibility of revealing their intentions openly. By the summer of 1943, the women's work teams assigned to production areas in Auschwitz had become a key part of the chain of events that would eventually lead to the preparation of underground resistance. These teams consisted of prisoners from various countries, but a significant number were Jewish women sent to workshops connected with the manufacture and handling of industrial explosive components. One such assignment was the powder processing facility, where daily tasks required precision, repetition, and strict adherence to rules. Labor inside these workshops was organized to prevent prisoners from gaining any influence over the production process. Each worker was responsible for a small, isolated task, performed on a narrow section of table, while guards supervised continuously. Visual inspections, tool counts, and rigid movement restrictions created an almost uninterrupted system of oversight. Yet this structure produced an unintended effect. The routine nature of the work encouraged a kind of complacency among the guards, who gradually grew accustomed to familiar patterns and became less alert during certain periods. The powder facility was divided into several stages of processing. Large containers held bulk material, which was then distributed into smaller units, sifted, and prepared for packaging. Prisoners who handled these materials were constantly in contact with fine particles that clung to their clothing, hands, and work surfaces. These traces appeared normal to guards and were viewed as part of everyday operations, while inspectors focused their attention on measuring the larger, officially recorded quantities. This working environment created an unusual opportunity. Women discovered they could transfer minute quantities of powder without drawing attention. There was no sudden decision behind this. It was a gradual realization born of daily exposure to the behavior of guards, the rhythm of the workshop, and the limited points where attention momentarily shifted. They noticed patterns, times of day when guards grew tired, moments when supervision became divided among several tasks, or instances when noise and movement in one section diffused focus in another. The women worked with extreme care. A single grain mattered. They allowed powder to adhere naturally to their garments during routine tasks and later removed tiny amounts during brief, unnoticed moments. These actions blended seamlessly into everyday movement. Each particle collected in this manner was insignificant alone, but over time, when accumulated carefully and consistently, it could become part of a meaningful reserve. The process demanded not only caution, but also strategic observation. The women studied every stage of movement, from the workshop to the barracks, identifying spots where supervision was the weakest. They analyzed when to act, when to remain still, and when to delay a transfer entirely. Their behavior had to remain indistinguishable from the routine of exhaustion and repetition that defined camp life. Excess caution could attract as much attention as carelessness. Months of this quiet, disciplined effort resulted in a steady accumulation of material. Though small in absolute terms, it represented far more than a physical resource. It demonstrated that the prisoners had found a way to act within the narrow boundaries imposed on them. This was resistance built not on force, but on observation, patience, and the ability to remain unseen. By late 1943, the women's contribution had become essential to the forming underground network. Their precise movements, constant vigilance, and willingness to accept risk helped create the foundation for actions that would soon extend far beyond the confines of the powder facility. By the autumn of 1943, the covert activities inside Auschwitz began to take on a more structured shape. Even without formal means of communication, prisoners gradually built a system of information exchange, grounded in observation, caution, and the subtle use of everyday moments. This network had no official leadership. Instead, it grew naturally from the shared desire to resist in an environment defined by constant surveillance and restrictions. The most active participants were those who had access to small but meaningful opportunities for communication, usually hidden within routine tasks. The women's work teams in the powder facility held a particularly important position within this developing structure. Their role was valuable not only because of their access to explosive powder, but also because they operated in an area considered highly sensitive. To turn this access into a resource, the underground needed reliable methods for moving small quantities of powder to individuals who could store or eventually use it. No member of the network possessed full knowledge of the entire system. Each person knew only a small part, a design intended to reduce risk. The methods of interaction were adapted to the strict rhythms of camp life. Prisoners discovered that certain work routes intersected at predictable times. These intersections became fleeting opportunities for passing information or materials. The exchanges happened without visible gestures or words, integrated seamlessly into ordinary movement. A slip of cloth dropped at the right moment, a minor adjustment in placement, or a brief pause in a familiar spot might serve as a signal. Anything more obvious could raise suspicion. Self-discipline was essential. Participants carried only fragments of knowledge about the broader operation. This limited exposure protected the group. If someone were suddenly questioned or searched, they would be unable to reveal the full extent of the network simply because they did not know it. Trust developed not through conversation, but through quiet consistency, through the observation of another prisoner's composure under pressure, and through the ability to maintain routine despite constant stress. Camp conditions themselves created opportunities for covert activity. Daily roll calls, long lines, transfers between sections, and medical inspections all involved gathering and movement. These situations allowed small signals, or the subtle exchange of an object, to blend into the larger mass of activity. Prisoners learned to treat their surroundings as part of a system of communication. Even the placement of a common item could carry meaning if done with intention. Over time, the underground network evolved into a layered structure in which each group fulfilled a specific role. The women assembling the powder supplied material. Others managed the transfer routes. A third group ensured safe storage until the powder could be used. The system adapted to changes in guard routines, shifts in work assignments, and unexpected inspections. Any alteration in the camp environment, whether a change in weather affecting workloads or a new guard rotation, was analyzed for potential risk or benefit. By the end of 1943, the network was stable enough to enable the gradual accumulation of a meaningful amount of powder. This did not yet mean that a full plan for open resistance had been formed, but it provided the necessary conditions for one to emerge. Under the constant threat of punishment, the participants continued their efforts with deliberate patience. Their persistence created the framework for an organized action that, though not yet defined, was becoming increasingly possible. The women in particular contributed through steady, precise, and nearly invisible work that forged the foundation of what would become one of the most significant episodes of resistance within the camp. As the underground network in Auschwitz grew stronger, one of its most difficult challenges emerged: where and how to store the powder that had been gathered. Although the women transported only microscopic portions at a time, the accumulated quantity slowly increased. This created a dangerous situation, because even a small reserve of explosive material required careful handling and absolute secrecy. The environment of the camp allowed no traditional hiding places. Any area could be searched without warning. Any object could be confiscated, and every item had to appear ordinary. Inside the women's barracks, where those involved in collecting the powder lived, there were a few modest spots that could serve as temporary hiding places. These spaces included cracks in wooden beams, narrow gaps between metal supports, or small cavities beneath the sleeping platforms. Storing powder in such locations demanded precision. Even the slightest spill could attract unwanted attention or lead to health and safety risks. For this reason, every portion was wrapped in tiny pieces of cloth or scraps of fabric that looked identical to the worn fragments often found in the barracks. Over time, the women developed a division of roles that increased the safety of the operation. Some gathered the powder, others transferred it, and a third group handled storage. This separation of responsibilities spread the danger across several individuals and minimized the risk that one single discovery would endanger the entire resistance effort. Those responsible for storage had to balance the demands of daily life with the constant awareness that inspections could occur at any moment. Routine events, such as cleaning or bedding changes, provided opportunities to reposition the hidden materials and avoid creating predictable patterns. Understanding the behavior of guards became a crucial skill. Some days, their inspections were brief and superficial, allowing for discreet movement of the material. Other days brought strict control, making any activity too dangerous. Flexibility was vital. The women adjusted their actions based on observation, always ensuring that their behavior matched the expected rhythm of camp life. Neither excessive caution nor visible tension could be allowed to draw attention. Beyond the barracks, additional temporary hiding places were sometimes used, storage areas for tools, repair materials, or cleaning supplies, occasionally offered brief shelters for small packets of powder. These zones appeared cluttered and were less likely to arouse suspicion, but they were never used for long. Overcrowding in such spaces could spark curiosity from guards. So these hiding places served as short-term stations in a rotating system of concealment. By early 1944, the network of hiding spots had expanded enough to store a substantial amount of powder. Even so, the threat of discovery remained constant. Participants continuously evaluated the safety of each location, prepared to relocate material if conditions changed. Alongside the growing reserve came a deeper understanding among the women that their work was becoming central to the broader resistance. Every grain of powder stored with care represented not only material for a future action, but also a symbol of persistence. The lengthy process of accumulation became a foundation for later events. It demanded patience, observation, and adaptability. The women involved operated quietly but determinedly, knowing that the survival of the underground effort depended on their consistency. Their commitment ensured that when the time came to act, the necessary resource would exist, built from countless small efforts carried out under constant threat. When the storage network inside the camp became stable enough to hold a meaningful amount of powder, the next challenge emerged: transferring the material to the prisoners, capable of assembling a functioning device. This stage was among the most dangerous because it required interaction between people from different sections of the camp, often separated by strict barriers and constant oversight. Any moment when two routes crossed became critical, demanding precision and absolute self-control. The transfer process relied on the carefully developed structure of covert contacts. The women who collected the powder in the factory understood that every particle they gathered needed to reach those with the technical capability to use it. The underground network functioned so that no participant held complete knowledge of the system. Those involved in moving the powder knew only their immediate contacts. Those preparing the device had no information about how the material had been obtained. This compartmentalization protected the entire operation by minimizing the damage a single breach could cause. The powder was typically passed inside tiny cloth fragments, small enough to appear meaningless within the camp environment. Such scraps of fabric were ubiquitous, indistinguishable from the worn remnants scattered throughout the barracks and work areas. The exchange took place at moments when groups of prisoners overlapped, for example, during marches to work or while returning to the barracks. These interactions blended naturally into the mass movement of people and drew no attention from the guards. The recipients, often skilled prisoners working in repair or maintenance units, bore the responsibility of covertly transporting the material to locations where it could be safely stored and eventually integrated into the construction of the device. Their positions sometimes granted them access to tools, workshop spaces, or storage areas that could be adapted for clandestine use. Even in these privileged spaces, oversight existed, but the physical environment provided occasional pockets of reduced supervision. In this phase, Choosing the safest routes became essential. No place was entirely secure, yet some pathways were monitored less intensely, especially those used for supply tasks or routine maintenance. For weeks, prisoners observed these routes, noting guard positions, bottlenecks, and moments of distraction. Their decisions relied on patterns that repeated day after day. Transfers were planned according to these patterns, always aligned with the natural flow of camp life. Every exchange was executed with precision. A single mistake, lingering too long, moving too quickly, appearing anxious, could have imperiled not only the individuals involved, but the entire network. Because of this, each transfer resembled a small operation requiring both mental and emotional control. Participants needed to appear as though they were simply enduring the familiar exhaustion and monotony of daily labor. Over the ensuing months, the powder accumulated by the women gradually reached those responsible for constructing the device. Progress was slow due to the small quantities and the risks involved, but the process continued steadily. The prisoners understood that even a modest charge, assembled under such circumstances, could have a meaningful impact on a future act of resistance. Each delivery became part of a larger effort, woven from many coordinated steps. By the time the final transfers were taking place, the movement of powder had become an integral element of underground life in the camp. It connected individuals separated by fences, patrols, and labor assignments, forming a hidden chain of cooperation. The women's persistence, matched by the careful work of those receiving and assembling the material, laid the groundwork for what would soon develop into an unprecedented act of defiance. Once enough powder had been accumulated and delivered to those capable of using it, the most technically demanding stage began, preparing a makeshift explosive device. Inside the camp, this task required not only skill, but also extraordinary caution. Prisoners with previous experience in handling tools or with technical backgrounds before their imprisonment became essential contributors. Their knowledge had to be applied discreetly, embedded within their normal duties so as not to arouse suspicion from the guards. Men assigned to repair or technical units had limited access to basic tools and materials. Although their workspaces were never entirely secluded, they were sometimes located away from the main paths of camp activity, creating rare, valuable moments when a guard's attention could not cover every detail. In these spaces, the prisoners gradually collected and modified items that visually resembled ordinary equipment, but could serve as structural components for the device. Every piece had to blend into the environment perfectly. The construction process progressed in extremely small increments. No prisoner could devote long hours to such work, and even brief periods of focus were dangerous. Instead, the device took shape through seconds stolen during transitions between tasks, through fleeting moments when guards were distracted, or through quiet minutes at the end of a shift. Each step required careful timing and an intuitive sense of when minor deviations from routine would go unnoticed within the broader rhythm of camp life. The powder delivered by the women was stored in multiple small caches until each portion could be integrated into the device. Concentrating too much material in one spot was considered too risky, so the builders redistributed the powder regularly. This both protected the supply from sudden inspections and allowed the gradual construction of the device's inner components. Every gram mattered, and every addition brought the project closer to completion. Those involved in assembling the device understood the significance of their task. Working with scarce materials and under constant surveillance, they aimed to create a mechanism capable of serving as a catalyst for future action. Their work represented more than technical craftsmanship. It was an act of commitment to the idea that resistance, however limited, remained possible. In this environment, the preparation of the device became not only a practical effort, but also a symbol of persistence and resolve. Each quiet adjustment and every careful movement carried the weight of risk and the hope that, at the critical moment, their hidden labor would contribute to a collective act of resistance, within one of the most tightly controlled environments of the war. By the middle of 1944, a growing sense of tension had settled over Auschwitz. Even under strict surveillance, prisoners sensed that the wider reality of the war was beginning to influence the atmosphere inside the camp. News reached them in fragments, carried by newly arrived prisoners, overheard in brief exchanges between guards, or inferred from sudden changes in routine. Although incomplete, these signals indicated that Germany's position in the war was weakening. For many prisoners, this subtle shift suggested that the moment for meaningful resistance might soon emerge. Members of the underground network observed that the guards themselves appeared increasingly strained, inspections sometimes lacked consistency, and certain sections of the camp experienced brief lapses in supervision. These moments, though rare, were invaluable. They allowed participants of the resistance to adjust routes, move materials, and refine their understanding of the camp's changing rhythm. Yet these opportunities also heightened the risk, because any miscalculated action could provoke immediate retaliation. During this period, the internal organization of labor within the camp also changed. Work assignments expanded, resulting in the redistribution of prisoners across different sectors. These movements unintentionally created new points of contact between individuals who had previously been separated by camp structure. Such intersections provided additional channels for covert communication and made it possible to update transfer routes for powder and information. With each shift, the underground carefully analyzed the implications for both risk and opportunity. Participants understood that preparation for an uprising could not be rigid. It had to evolve in response to the shifting conditions of camp life. Changes in roll call procedures, unexpected inspections, new guard rotations, or alterations in work schedules all required rapid adaptation. The underground functioned like a finely balanced mechanism, responding precisely to each fluctuation. Even seemingly insignificant modifications in routine could reshape the safety of certain paths or render a previously reliable hiding place too dangerous. The women who collected powder faced increasing challenges. Their workload grew heavier, and exhaustion became more profound. Still, they persisted, recognizing the significance of the material they were supplying. The powder they had gathered now held tangible purpose. It represented the possibility of damaging critical parts of the camp infrastructure when the moment for resistance arrived. Despite intensifying surveillance and the constant threat of exposure, they continued to observe, calculate, and act with steady determination. Meanwhile, the prisoners, assembling the device, worked to finalize its structure. They analyzed potential targets, considered the timing most likely to exploit weaknesses in the guard rotation, and tested the durability of the materials they had quietly prepared. They understood that the charge needed to be small enough to move inconspicuously, yet powerful enough to create a meaningful disruption. Their planning relied on meticulous study of the physical layout of the camp, identifying locations where even a limited act could have strategic impact. By late summer 1944, the underground felt the convergence of circumstances: external military developments, internal pressure within the camp, and the steady accumulation of resources. No single plan existed in written form or in full detail. Instead, there was a collective sense that the time for decisive action was approaching. The prisoners who had worked silently for months were prepared to face the risks ahead. The growing determination within the camp was not born of impulse. It was the result of prolonged effort under constant threat. Women and men alike contributed to this slow-moving yet deliberate preparation, each action building upon countless others. Their readiness marked a turning point, signaling that the underground's long and hidden labor was nearing the moment when it could be transformed into open resistance. By the early autumn of 1944, the underground activity within Auschwitz reached its highest level of intensity. After months of careful work, the participants found themselves approaching the moment when the accumulated material and technical preparation could be put to use. Every action during this stage carried increased weight. Even the most ordinary movements were assessed for risk, and every opportunity for covert coordination had to be evaluated with utmost precision. The resistance was entering a phase in which scattered efforts needed to merge into a single, coherent structure. The women who had quietly transported tiny amounts of powder understood that their long-term task was nearing completion. Each portion they had transferred contributed to a larger reserve that was now in the hands of those capable of employing it effectively. Their work formed the foundation on which the entire plan depended. Through patience, consistency, and the ability to remain unnoticed under strict supervision, they created the essential resource needed for what would become one of the most significant acts of resistance within the camp. At the same time, the prisoners who assembled the device were finalizing the last technical steps. They evaluated the strength of the materials, considered possible ways to deploy the charge, and aligned their preparations with the realities of the camp structure. Their task required accuracy, as any miscalculation could jeopardize the entire effort. Despite the limitations of their workspace and the constant vigilance of the guards, they worked to produce a device that could function at a decisive moment and provide an opening for larger-scale actions. Inside the camp, conditions continued to shift. Guard rotations changed, work assignments fluctuated, and the number of prisoners moving through certain sections varied from day to day. Each change required rapid assessment. The underground reacted by adjusting routes, reviewing hiding places, and reassessing the feasibility of certain actions. Although the camp environment remained harsh and tightly controlled, the constant movement of people and resources created occasional gaps that the resistance could exploit. In these final weeks, the participants felt a growing sense of responsibility. After enduring months of risk and uncertainty, they recognized that every remaining action mattered. Their contributions were no longer abstract or distant. They had taken on tangible form. For the women who had moved powder, grain by grain, the scale of their impact became increasingly clear. Their endurance demonstrated the power of cumulative effort, even when expressed through seemingly minor acts hidden within the monotony of forced labor. As the moment of uprising drew closer, the camp's underground community entered a state of concentrated readiness. The prisoners understood that the device they had prepared was only one element of a wider movement involving multiple groups across different parts of the camp. Although the circumstances prevented the development of precise, unified plans, the shared purpose connected these scattered efforts. The existence of such resistance held enormous symbolic importance. It represented the prisoners' will to preserve their humanity and challenge the system that sought to control every aspect of their lives. The significance of the women's contribution became unmistakable. Their work provided not only the material basis for the uprising, but also a demonstration of resilience under extreme conditions. They operated quietly, without the ability to speak openly, relying on persistence rather than force. Their efforts showed that even in a setting defined by deprivation and surveillance, individuals could find ways to act collectively and meaningfully. Through their courage and discipline, these women became central figures in one of the most important examples of organized resistance within the camp. Their story remains a testament to determination and the capacity for coordinated action in circumstances where such efforts seemed nearly impossible.